When you first get into fly fishing, it can feel like you're drinking straight out of a fire hose.
You've got to figure out what gear to buy, where to go fish, casting, picking the right fly. And what do you even do when you hook into a fish?
Hey, it's okay. I know that fly fishing can sometimes feel like your first middle school dance. You walk in, you're sweaty, you're nervous, and you've got no clue what to do with your hands. So, to hopefully avoid those uncomfortable flashbacks to middle school, we've put this video together where we take all the information and tactics about fly fishing and just distill them down to their absolute basics.
And Spencer and I, we've got, a combined 40 years of fly fishing experience?
Yeah, we're old.
And here at VFC, we're dedicated to helping complete beginners, people who have never touched a fly rod before in their entire lives, go out and have success on the water.
And that's exactly what we're gonna do today. We're gonna take you from complete beginner, never picked up a fishing pole before, to catching your very first fish on a fly rod. This is the VFC Crash Course.
This fly fishing crash course has 3 objectives: the what, the where, and the how. We're gonna take a second to cover the what and the where, and then we're gonna send you on out to the river and you'll meet up with Spencer to talk about the how. Objective number 1. What gear do you need to get started? I'll just start off by saying that fly fishing gear, it's a never-ending rabbit hole. They have come out with tons of cool gizmos and gadgets to help improve the angler experience. But again, the purpose of this crash course is to wade through all that gear, to put on our blinders, and to focus on those things that you actually need to catch your first fish. All that other stuff, you can add it later on. So here is a list of the bare necessities. First, you need a rod and reel combo with fly line, some leaders, tippet, nippers, and this next one might shock you, but you might need some flies to start fly fishing. Floating, a net, polarized sunglasses, and a fishing license. And if we want to just sneak over and peek down the rabbit hole just a little bit, there are some things that you don't technically need, but they're nice to have. And that's forceps, split shot, strike indicators, and then something to put all this stuff in, like a bag or a sling pack. And the fastest and easiest way to snag all this stuff is to pick up one of our VFC starter packs. It's a bundle of high quality, high performance gear that includes everything you need to get started all in one pack. We've also got an entire video that dives a little bit deeper into the gear. I'll throw a link to the starter packs and that video in the description. Moving on to objective number 2. Where do you go fly fish? Let's talk about 2 simple strategies that are going to help you find a place to fish right off the bat. First, you can visit your local fly shop and ask for some information. In my experience, they're usually quite nice and willing to point you in the right direction. In exchange for their help, I usually like to pick up a cool new hat or some flies as a thank you. But if you're kind of like me and you like to do things on your own, or maybe you don't have a local fly shop nearby, we'll run through strategy number 2. Open up your favorite search engine and type in places to fish, the name of your state. This is going to bring up a bunch of blog posts or articles, maybe something like the top 10 places to fish in your state. Click into those and start browsing. Then once we have a list of places that we can go check out, you get to do one of my favorite parts about fly fishing: explore. And then if you're still having a hard time trying to find somewhere to fish, I just made an entire video walking you through the step-by-step process of how we found some of our favorite places to fish. I'll throw that link in the description. All right, we've got the gear. We know where we're going to fish, but before we head out to the river, there's one more thing we need to cover. I highly recommend practicing setting up your rod and tying knots before you go fishing. It's really not that hard to do, and it's going to be quite annoying and frustrating if you see this big old fish rising and you're sitting there fumbling with videos and diagrams while you're out there on the water. And you're going to need to learn 2 different knots: the handshake knot, which is how you attach your leader to your fly line, and the clinch knot, which is how you'll attach your flies to your leader or tip it. And so after you're done with this crash course video, take that little bit of extra time to practice your knots and setting up your rod until you can do it without any videos or other help. I'll throw a link to our knot tying and rod setup video in the description if you need it. You've got the gear. You know where you're going. You've been practicing your knots. Now it's time to head out to the river and meet up with Spencer, and he's going to cover objective number 3, how to fly fish.
You've got the gear and you know where to go fishing. This is exciting. But now we're going to talk about maybe the most important thing, and that's the how. How do you actually fly fish? We've got 5 quick lessons that will build a great basic foundation of skills and knowledge so you can get out there and start catching fish on a fly rod. And lesson number 1 is casting. Something to remember with fly casting is it's not that hard. It might look a little difficult in Instagram videos and the river runs through it or whatnot, but at the end of the day, it's a very simple process that just takes a little bit of time and dedication to understand. You could spend years becoming a champion caster, but guess what? You don't need to have championship level skills if you want to catch some fish. Focus on mastering these basics, practice them a little bit before you go out on the water, and you will be more than ready to cast that fly rod and catch some fish. Fly casting is a very simple process that involves just a few steps, and we're going to go over those right now. So you've got your fly rod, I'm all strung up, and I highly recommend for beginners to make sure that you practice your fly casting in a nice open space like this. Get away from snags, get away from the water, and just focus on getting the mechanics of the cast dialed in. The first thing that I want you to remember as you start to make your fly cast is you are going to be moving your rod tip from about a 45-degree angle in front of you, so about right here, to about a 45-degree angle behind you. I like to remember I've got my rod started about 45 in front of me, and then when I move the rod back, I like to try and stop the rod so that it's level with my ear. If I do that, the tip of the rod travels back to about that 45-degree angle. You want to keep your fly cast between those 2 angles, because if you start to let your rod tip drop on the back cast and on the front cast, your line is going to make this giant arc. And we are not going for arcs, we are going for loops. That's what we're trying to form with the fly line, is a nice tight loop. So we've got the rod, we know we need to move it between 45 in front of us and 45 behind us. Now, how do we move it? Do we just start going away and just moving it as quick as we can? Or do we just very daintily, because it's fly fishing and we're delicate? No. What you want is a happy medium between those 2. You want to cast with purpose, but the fly rod's going to do a lot of the work for you. Make sure you put some emphasis and energy behind your cast, but don't worry about trying to throw the cast out there. The rod's going to do the work for you. As you move between the 45 in front and 45 behind you, you want to move the rod with purpose. You want to smoothly accelerate, but when you get to those points, you want to stop the rod. As you can see, I've got the rod stopped, but the fly line continues to move. That's because that fly line is forming that loop that we talked about. It's making that loop in the air. And the rod stops, but the line still has to unfurl behind you and in front of you before you can move on to the next part of the fly cast. It is very important to remember that you stop the rod at each point and then move the rod after the line is straightened out. Now, how do you know if the line's straightened out? You've got these loops in the air and I'm telling you to pay attention to them. Well, after a while, you can feel it. You don't even need to look at it. I could sit here and make this cast. I don't have to look at it. I've been doing this for a while. But I highly recommend to beginners, watch that fly line. Because as you see those loops start to unfurl and you move the rod, you are going to feel what that feels like in the rod, and that is going to help build the muscle memory so that eventually you don't have to look at your cast and you can just go to town, make these casts, and put them down nice right in front of the fish, and he'll gobble it all up. The number one mistake that beginners make with their fly cast is related to timing. Usually, they're either going way too slow or they'll go way too fast on the back cast. So, if you're moving the fly rod and you hear this whip sound, sounds like you're Indiana Jones out there, that means you're going way too quickly on the back cast. Your line's actually snapping over itself. You want to make sure, as you move the rod, again, watch the loops unfurl to make sure that you're moving the rod at the right time. You want to make sure it's a nice, even casting cadence. Fly casting happens in a very even rhythm. You can see I'm waiting the same amount of time on the back cast and the front cast. Make sure you give that line enough time to unfurl behind you before you move the rod to the front cast. And finally, the last thing to remember about fly casting is don't overthink it. It's a very simple process. You're just moving the rod between 2 points, giving the line enough time to unfurl. That's all you're trying to do. You might hear some fancy casting instructors tell you to watch your elbow or watch your wrist. Don't worry about that stuff right now. Get the timing down, understand what a good loop feels and looks like, and you're gonna be much better off. Keep it simple, get the rod moving, and above all, remember that a fly cast exists to get your flies in front of the fish. Focus on making casts land where you want them, and you'll find that you'll be able to pick this up pretty quickly. Now that we've learned to cast a fly rod, let's move on to lesson 2, which is all about picking the right fly. Since this is fly fishing, we've got to have a discussion about the flies themselves. Now, a majority of a fish's diet is going to be bugs. They don't just eat worms. But to be more specific, trout are eating aquatic insects. Most aquatic insects share the same basic life cycle. They're born in the river, they hatch out from their egg, and then they emerge up into the adult version, which is the bug that's flying around. Then they go out, they find another bug, they mate, they lay their eggs back in the water, and then they die. Different aquatic insects are going to hatch at different times of the year. So that means our job as fly anglers is to try and match what we have in our box to the flies that are active right now. The best way to do that is when you get to the water, don't just immediately tie a fly on and start fishing. Take a minute to watch and observe your surroundings. Specifically, you want to look for any bugs that you see on the water. And if there's fish that are actively rising, they're coming up to eat those bugs off the top of the water, even better. You also want to spend some time looking around the water. Later on in the summer, you get terrestrial insects like ants, beetles, and grasshoppers, and even cicadas that can be blown from the streamside vegetation into the river, and that is a big ticket meal for a trout. It also pays to look in the water as well. What I mean by that is you reach in the water, you grab a rock, and you turn it over. You look at all the bugs that are crawling around underneath that rock, and that will give you an idea of what bugs are available to the fish at that moment. Once you've gathered your information, it's time to actually pick the fly. You're going to pick this fly using our right fly formula. It's really simple, and it'll help you pick the right fly every time. The first step of that formula is to match the real bug to one in your box based on size. Size is the absolute most important thing. If you go too big or too small, the fish might ignore it. Once you've found one that's about the right size, then you want to pay attention to the shape. Some bugs are going to have long, skinny bodies with really long tails and really tall wings. Some bugs might be longer with wings that lay on top of their body. And some bugs might have tent-like wings that flutter when they try to move on the water. The last step in our right fly formula is to match the color. This is the least important, and if you have a color that exactly matches what you see on the water, that's awesome. Tie that on. But don't worry if your shade of brown is a little different than what you see in the real world. The trout in most rivers tend to not be too picky about color. Once we've figured out what flies we're going to tie on, it's time to move on to lesson 3. We've picked out our bugs, we're excited, and we are ready to get out and start fishing. But before you make that first cast, it's important to know about a little thing called line management. Line management is going to impact the way that your flies look and behave on the water. And your job as a fly angler is to get as natural a presentation as possible. Now, what do I mean by natural presentation? Well, the short and sweet of it is you want the fake bugs that you picked out to look as much like the real thing as possible. And the number one thing you've got to look out for is something that we call drag. If your flies have drag on them, that is a dead giveaway to the fish that they're not real, and the fish are gonna be like, hey, Bob, look, more fake flies today. I'm not falling for that again. The easiest way to identify drag is looking for a wake behind your flies as they're moving down the water. It's almost gonna look like they're riding a jet ski, just right across the top of the water with a lot of movement behind them. What you're aiming for is a completely drag-free drift, something that looks natural. It helps me to visualize a leaf falling on the water, because if you've ever watched leaves fall into a river, they just kind of drift and move with the current. There's no extra movement to the leaf at all. That is what you want your flies to look like, drifting naturally without any drag. And drag matters not just for fish and dry flies, but also if you're nymphing. If that indicator has any drag on it, that's a dead giveaway that those flies are not drifting in a natural way. The best way for a beginner to combat drag is to position yourself correctly in the river so that you can get a cast into the seam without too much trouble. Now, we haven't covered what seams are yet. That's coming up quick, so just hold on and bear with me and we'll get through it. But what I mean by positioning myself correctly is I've got a bit of slow water right here and I've got some fast water right in front of me. Where those two meet is what we call a seam. I want to get my flies on that seam. So I'm going to make a cast. And I want to cast so that all my fly line and my flies land on the seam. If I do that, that ensures I have a drag-free drift that looks as natural as possible. If I land my fly in this calm water, if I can get it over there, but my fly line's in the quick water, that's going to create drag instantly because the quick water is pulling on my dry fly, making it skitter across the top like it's riding a jet ski. Finally, one common mistake I see beginners make is they will throw a cast that might not be very good, and then they'll instantly go yank up really hard to recast. That can spook the fish a lot of the times. If you make a bad cast, that's okay. Let it ride, let the cast ride out, and then once it's come back to you a little bit more, that's when you can pick up, recast, and put those flies perfectly on the seam. Now it's time to move on to lesson 4. We've talked about casting, we've talked about picking the right fly, and we just went over how to make those flies look as natural as possible when they're on the water. The next step is knowing where to cast. I got this beautiful river behind me, and for a newbie, where are you gonna start? Do you just start throwing casts anywhere and everywhere, hoping to land something? Kind of like my dating life? Knowing where fish are gonna hold in the river is a skill that we call reading water, and there is a ton that goes into reading water. For a beginner, you are concerned with looking for one specific feature, and that would be a seam. I mentioned those just a moment ago, but let's dive into them again right here. There's fast water here, there's slow water here, they meet, there might be some bubbles, maybe even a little bit of foam to show you where the seam is, but that is what you're looking for. Now, trout are gonna be in those seams because trout, like me, are lazy critters. They wanna do the absolute least amount of work for the most amount of food. They'll hang out near seams because they can sit in the slow water and not spend very much energy moving, but as food comes by in the fast water, the fish can quickly dart out, grab it, and then go back into the slow part, kick back and put their fins up on their lazy fish and watch a game or something. As a beginner, when you get to the river and you're ready to start fishing, keep it simple. Just look for the seams and cast your flies there. We have learned a lot. Now we're coming up to the point of the video that you've probably all been waiting for. How to fight fish and put them in the net. If all goes according to plan, you're gonna watch a fish come up and chomp your dry fly, or if you're fishing nymphs, you'll see your indicator move, and that means you have hooked a fish. But what comes next? Well, the best piece of advice I can give you is please, 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 don't freak out, right? Do not lose your cool. There is no reason to have a cardiac episode just because you hooked into a fish. One of the common mistakes that I see a lot of beginners make is they hook into a fish and they forget how their arms work. They forget every law of gravity, and they're just stuck there like, what do I do? What do I do? Well, here's what you do. Tip number one, lift the rod tip straight up in the air. Now, this ain't the Bassmaster Classic. You're not Bill Dance, okay? You're gonna lift the rod tip firmly, straight up. You're not gonna yank back on it, okay? You're just gonna lift straight up with the rod tip. That is gonna drive the hook point home. The next thing that you wanna do is make sure that you've got some of your fly line under your finger pressed against the cork, because you have to keep tension on the fly line throughout the entire fight. If you let your fly line go slack while you've got a fish on, there is a very good chance the fish is gonna spit the hook and it's gonna run off and tell all its buddies, hey Billy, yeah, I made the human mad again, it was hilarious. You don't want that. You do not want Billy the trout to know about you losing your cool, okay? So keep tension on the fly line. Of course, there is nuance to this, because if you just clamp that line tight, well, if the fish wants to move and you don't let it move at all, this leader ain't very thick. That's gonna snap the leader. You're gonna lose the fish. Billy the trout's gonna laugh at you, or it's just in a bad situation again. And one more reminder about the tension on the fly line. It's gonna be a balancing act. Sometimes you've gotta let them run a little bit. Sometimes you've gotta really pull that line in, maybe even put them on the reel to actually get the fish where you need it to be. It's a balancing act that you are going to learn and develop with the more fish that you catch. So the best way to learn is to go out there and catch a few. You're gonna lose some, but that's fishing. Now, let's talk about fighting the fish for a minute. If you've used spin casting or bait casting gear at all, you're familiar with the heavier rod that you can really just kind of yank on the fish and pull them around and move them to where you want them to be. Yeah, some of the bigger fish will put up a good fight, but you're using the rod to do a lot of that heavy lifting. In fly fishing, it's a little bit different. We've got a long rod, it's a lot lighter, and what you're trying to do is not so much force the fish where you want it, but use the rod and the line and the pressure that you're putting on that fish to guide the fish into the net. If you think of it as just pulling the fish into you as quick as you can, you're gonna lose quite a few of them doing it that way. You wanna think of it as trying to guide the fish towards you to where you can reach out with your net and scoop them up. Let's say everything went perfectly. Well, what happens when you got that fish in the net? Well, there's a couple of quick tips. First off, trout are very delicate, very sensitive creatures. So the less time you spend handling them, the better. We strongly encourage that you keep the fish wet at all times, even when you're getting the hook out. Get your hands wet before you reach in. Hold the fish gently. Don't squeeze the fish. That can actually damage their internal organs. At that point, the fish should have been in the water pretty much the whole time, because you're doing that entire operation in your net. Now, if you want to get a picture for the gram, go for it. Lift the fish up. Don't squeeze it. Just hold it gently. Take the picture and don't let the fish be out of the water for more than 5 seconds. Once you've got your picture, you put the fish back in the net, you find some nice calm water, and you let it go. And after you take that picture, send it our way. We would love to see it. And boom, just like that, you've got your first fish. Have yourself a Diet Coke and wings. You earned it. One of the best ways to learn is to see all of this stuff put into practice. So we took someone who has never fly fished before, never even picked up a fishing pole, and ran them through this crash course to show you exactly what it looks like. You're gonna wanna watch that video to see if they can actually catch a fish their first time fishing.